that we want to hear from. So this is kind of starting our look towards discovery science. And we're very fortunate this afternoon that we have Dr. Sean Davis with us, who is well known to ARS, and is going to talk to us about his thoughts on components of an agricultural data ecosystem. So Sean, I know that you have some introductory information in your presentation, so we very much appreciate your being here.
So I'm always reminded when I come to a place like this and start hearing about goats and ducks, and not just one kind of duck, but 12 different kinds of ducks, the ones that legs and the ones that don't, and et cetera, how distant we are from each other, even though we're just down the road at NIH, but also how close we are when we start thinking about the science and the challenges that we face. What I'm going to talk about here is sort of some high-level stuff. It's not, unfortunately, going to be a lot of genotype or phenotype, but it is going to be a part of an ecosystem that I think is important in any biomedical research organization these days. So for those of you who do genomic data science at all, this is a project that I'm involved with pretty heavily and have been for over like almost a decade and a half at this point, called Bioconductor. And Bioconductor is a wonderful experience, has been a wonderful experience for me because it's not just a software project to solve genomic data science problems, but it's an active community where the project grows because of need and because of people giving. And I don't know what magic created this environment, but at this point we have 1,400 software packages, all with specific goals and addressing specific problems in genomics. These are developed by about 4,000 different software developers with an active community of about 300,000 downloads a year. So it's projects like this that make it possible to talk about data science that bridges from these various species of ducks to goats to cattle to humans, etc. Things that tie us together are the data and a lot of the same questions that we're asking. So I wanted to sort of review for myself, because it sometimes helps me to think about when I go to talk in an organization, what's the organization do? What do they think of themselves as? And my guess is that many of you in the room have not read the ARS vision statement recently, but it's short and sweet, leading America towards a better future through agricultural research and information. So I put a few things in bold: future, agricultural research, and information. And the mission statement starts like this: conducts research to develop and transfer solutions, provide information access and dissemination to ... ensure high quality, safe food, assess nutritional needs, sustain a competitive economy, enhance a natural resource base and the environment, and provide economic opportunities for rural citizens, communities, and societies as a whole. So we're focusing, I think, this conversation on genotype to phenotype, but this is what ARS says it does. So when you think about all the pieces that are in this ARS mission, many of them, in fact, probably, I would say all of them, revolve around the idea of data and information and how to share that between communities. So communities of ARS researchers, but also the commercial communities, your breeder communities, your livestock communities, now we need to start talking about consumers and how we interact with them. All of these things play into an ARS data ecosystem. So it's not enough to say that we're talking about genotype to phenotype as the data ecosystem. It has to extend beyond that. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the room has to think about how to get that into their bullet points for their 2-year plan, but it is a really driving sort of overarching theme in, I would guess, most of the discussions in the room. So when I think of NCI has a vision and mission statement, and it's longer and more complicated, but I think of NCI's, 1/3 of NCI's mission as this: how do we heal those who develop cancer? So traditionally, what we've done, and I'm a pediatric oncologist, so traditionally what we've done is we've developed clinical trials. And these clinical trials typically have a randomization. So a patient comes in with a certain type of cancer. We randomize the patient to get one kind of treatment or another, and then we watch them over some period of time to see if they do better when they get a treatment or not. And that's worked really well, and so even the idea of precision medicine is kind of funny to me, because in pediatrics we've been doing precision medicine, just the definition of precision medicine has changed for about 50 or 60 years. So these clinical trials are great and they answer a specific question. Unfortunately, they're super expensive, and the patients coming into these trials typically have to meet these eligibility criteria, and so you end up with smaller and smaller bins, and it makes it harder and harder to learn from one clinical trial to the next if the clinical trials are designed to focus on a specific question. So genomics and data science in biomedical research has sort of transformed things a little bit. I'm going to tell three little vignettes. There's a whole series of articles in the New England Journal of Medicine about the changing face of clinical trials. How many of you have heard of 23andMe? Okay, so, and so I'm not going to argue that they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, but they're doing something different. So they're doing direct-to-consumer, genotyping, and on an as-needed phenotyping base, as-needed phenotyping. And so I was struck about a year and a half ago when we had a 23andMe speaker next to, thankfully the night before, next to a person who was talking about a very large clinical trial. So the very large clinical trial was 900 patients. 900 patients was the largest clinical trial for this disease. And 23andMe, just the night before, had told us about their 1.5 million patients and how they had been able to do a GWAS without having the phenotype information in hand in 3 weeks. They had emailed out a bunch of people a form, or an email form. A few thousand of them had sent it back. They had enough data from those few thousand, plus the genotypes that they had in hand, to do a genotype or a genome-wide association study with literally no money. And so that really made me think about how we need to change the way we think about research. It's not enough to say that 23andMe is doing something different than what I'm doing. They're doing exactly what I'm doing. They're just doing it in a different way. AACR, American Association for Cancer Research, has come up with a similar kind of idea. The data are the limit here, the limiting factor. So this is a pay-to-play kind of approach. Some very large organizations, 4 or 5, actually started out, I think as 7 academic institutions got together to say, if I share my data with you, will you share your data with me? And AACR put together the infrastructure to do this, and they ended up with several tens of thousands of patients, exome data, so basically the stuff that we're used to working with every day, plus and this was the caveat, these patients had to be phenotyped at a level that allowed a study to be done. So they didn't say specifically what the phenotypes were, but there had to be enough phenotypes there that the data were usable to do some kind of work, some kind of study. So this is a model that was brought to NCI last year, or a couple of years ago, at a cancer center meeting. And one of the things that the NCI was struggling with is, how do we work with groups that have defined a way to share data that doesn't include us, and more importantly, is not entirely open? So these data sharing models that NIH has really adopted are totally open models. And those work really well for primary research, but as we transition toward data as a commodity and patients as a commodity, and in your case, livestock as a commodity, and the information about them as a commodity, how do you share it in a way that everybody benefits, but protects intellectual property? And so I'm giving these as a couple of different models. There's a third model, Foundation Medicine, which is a large provider of genotyping services, and they've expanded their scope to provide informatics associated with those genotyping services for patients with cancer. They do a very small panel of cancer-associated genes, and they do this for profit as a service. They didn't start out with the idea that they were going to share the data, but through a cooperative agreement with NCI, they've decided to share 18,000 patients worth of data publicly. It's not without, you have to say that you're a researcher and can respect the privacy of the patients, but the data were made available through this negotiation process. So different data models for data sharing, we have to adopt them all. So switching gears a little bit, that was all of SEDS up to this point is focused on how do we think about and cure cancer patients. But we have another couple of questions which get to a broader scope of things. How do we prevent people from getting cancer in the first place? And that's a genomics question to a certain extent, but we know it's much more than that, right? It's an environment problem. Somebody mentioned about socioeconomic status and how that interplays with health. So all of those things come into how do we prevent people from getting cancer. We don't have a very good handle on that because we don't have good data to go along with these things. We as researchers don't have it. Insurance companies do, and they're gathering it. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And then how do we promote health in those affected by cancer? So cancer doesn't just affect the patient at a given time. The patient hopefully recovers and then has a set of chronic diseases associated with cancer cure or cancer remission. And they also have family members that are affected both from a genotypic level, what's my chance of getting disease, but also at a phenotypic level. There's no one who's been through cancer who isn't changed as a person and whose family is not changed by that. So these are all things that impact patient health, and they're all part of what NCI's, in my mind, NCI's mission is. And if we think about the impact of an individual intervention on a patient, the ones that are in these last couple of bullet points, and not the first one, are the ones that have the largest public health impact. And I think a lot of the same kinds of things you could probably say about your own organisms or your own livestock or crops. The kinds of things that we do at an individual crop, at an individual plant level, are not necessarily the same things that we would do when we think about the crop as a whole. So cancer genotype to phenotype, just to bring this back a little bit. This is my little hat tilt to data engineering and infrastructure. So the Cancer Genome Atlas is, and the reason I'm bringing this up is that I got the sense in hearing you guys this morning that you have a lot of the same kinds of issues, how to handle large data sets, how to make them accessible to people, et cetera. So this is one potential option. So the Cancer Genome Atlas was started back in 2007, so it's been around for a while. It was a set of working groups and cooperative groups. It's 2.5 petabytes of data, so that's a lot of data for one data set. It's only 11,000 patients, which is the crazy thing. So 11,000 patients equals 2.5 petabytes. That's 2,500 terabytes. 33 different tumor types, 10 rare cancers. That's an important detail because rare cancers are rare. And anything that we can do to collect them is a good thing. And all the information is collected into just 212,000 separate files, right? That's all you need to analyze TCGA. So how many of you have heard of FAIR data principles? Okay, I'm going to go through it really quickly then. FAIR, F-A-I-R, it's an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are principles that were put out in 2011 that we should try to apply to open data. And what does this mean in practice? It means that when we make data open, it's not enough to park it on a website. We want to assign meaning to it, assign value to it. We have to label it. We have to have it in formats that people can understand. It has to be self-describing. And ideally, it's attributable. That is, we can figure out who it came from, and reusable. Reusable here is not just a technical thing. Licensing, provenance, who owns it, who owned the derivatives of it, et cetera. These are all important things for you guys. They're less important for the government because we paid for it and we told people that it was going to be accessible. So the solution This is the fourth iteration of how to make the TCGA data, that hundreds of thousands of files available. It's a website. It's a very expensive website to maintain. Going into this, so I mentioned this is the fourth iteration. So these data have been passed from one data warehouse to another. This is the fourth one. And even at this level, after going through the fourth iteration of data cleanup, there was still months of work to clean up the metadata and design a data model that fit what people wanted and needed out of the data. This requires people, not just a bunch of hardware. This is very person intensive. And the idea for this Genomic Data Commons was to accept all of NCI's genomic data. And one of the challenges that NCI has realized is that while they're technically potentially able to take terabytes and terabytes of data, as people put in more and more complex phenotypes, we have to develop data models for each one. So NCI does probably tens of genomic studies a week if you look across the entire extramural community. Trying to get all those in there it's impossible without a small army of people. People is the important detail here. Genomic Data Commons infrastructure, I'm not going to go through this other than I heard there was discussion about a data commons being developed by an agricultural data commons. We could potentially talk about the technical details about how to do some of this stuff. This data commons is hosted at University of Chicago, so it's hosted in a private data center. That has advantages, particularly for international collaborations, where putting things on, say, Amazon is a no-no. So limitations, though, the standard data model, standard model for large data. Even if you warehouse it and make it accessible, highly findable, highly attributable, and reusable, you still have this problem of it's 2.5 petabytes of data. So how do I get it as a user? Storage and data protection costs are about $2 million a year. So again, before you embark on a data commons, this is small data these days. 2.5 petabytes is small by genomic standards. $2 million a year. That doesn't end, right? That's a cost that continues. Downloading data at 10 gigabits a second. None of us in the room have a 10 gigabit connection. Would take 23 days. Most of us are on a 1 gig connection, so multiply that by 10. So 230 days, etc. So fair data, these findable, attributable, interoperable, reusable, it's not enough. You have to make the data actually usable, not just available. The best science happens in teams. So how do we make the data usable and accessible to teams? Reproducibility shouldn't be hard. That is, if I figure out a way to analyze a data set, it shouldn't be hard to give it to you, to give my analysis method to you and have you reuse it or reproduce my results, particularly for doing this on the same data in the same ecosystem, data ecosystem. The impact of the data is extended by this idea of new tools and new data. So within our individual groups, we have an institutional knowledge and we build a tool set, right? As an within your lab or within your group, you build a tool set that you then reuse. If we as a large community, a large genomics or agricultural research community, were able to build tools and have those tools be thought of as organizational tools and data sets as organizational data sets that were easily interoperable and accessible by each other, shareable by each other with a click of a button, wouldn't that be a good thing? So that's a goal, I guess, that I would think about. And finally, we need to proactively, continually measure and act on the utility of data. And why do I say that? Because you think genomic sequencing is expensive. Storing genomics data is much more expensive. So we've run into this problem at NIH. We have policies in place that force us to share genomic data. What we don't have in place is the money that says how we're going to fund those policies. So we now have to begin to think about how do we prioritize data. And one way you can do it is to say, get together as a community like this and say, oh, I like this one, I don't like that one. But if we have a data ecosystem that has the ability to measure how the data are used, what the utility is in some real meaningful way, then we can make objective decisions about how we store data. So an interesting fact about the TCGA data is that it's 2.5 petabytes of data, but when you process it down to, say, the RNA-seq files, down to gene expression files, and the variant calls from whole genome sequencing down to variant call files, you end up with about 100 gigabytes of data. And if you look at the 1,200 or 1,300 TCGA publications, my guess is that 95% of them only use that 100 gigabytes of data. And the 2.5 petabytes is used by a very small proportion of the population, the research population. So we could make a judgment about what the value is of spending $2 million a year to support those data sets if we know that only 5% of the research output is coming from them. That's the kind of thing that we'd like to be able to do. I'm going to skip over this other than to say the standard model of computational analysis, which is, I would guess, is the one that a lot of us are using here, which is to download data, download software, maintain networks and disks ourselves, it's a good one. It's a relatively cost-effective one in the sense of we know what the capital expenditure is. But the idea of putting everything in a centralized resource that's expandable, like cloud infrastructure, is sort of a new model. So imagine now that all the data are parked in a public cloud. That's all cool. But now let's build an infrastructure around that so that when I develop a tool, it's going to run in the same infrastructure. So now if you want to run the same tool on the same data or on different data, the tool's already there. We've already figured out how to run it in this infrastructure. If I want to share the data, I don't make a copy of it anymore. I just give you access to my copy. And costs then also unfortunately, become fairly clear. You pay for everything that you do in the cloud. It turns out that's probably actually in the long term cost effective, but it's a different model. Why am I spending time thinking about, or why do we spend time thinking about making these data usable? Well, this is just one example, a case study. A researcher mined TCGA data to study her own ovarian cancer. So I was thinking as you guys were talking this morning about community engagement, this is the kind of story that it like boggles your mind, right? That there's data there, and it impacted a patient, not because her doctor accesses or what, it's because she did it herself. She was able to do it herself. And she's a bioinformatics researcher, but she was able to get the data and access it and then use it to make some treatment decisions with her treatment team. And I could imagine that the same kind of, if the same kind of data access were available to some of your communities, particularly the ones that are more fragmented, there's a possibility that someone could actually make some breakthroughs based on just access to the data and more importantly, the ability to operate on it. And if she's able to share her information back to this community somehow in a meaningful way, we all learn from that. Just to point out, the cancer cloud pilots, putting the data in the cloud, and the genomic data commons are just 2 data points in a very, very, very large cancer data ecosystem. And so when you think about what we do in genomics, a lot of what we do in genomics is draw from different aspects of biomedical information, either literature, databases, et cetera. All of those things, in my mind, are part of a data ecosystem. And the easier that you make it for individual researchers to access these potentially not very large, but very usable resources, the easier you make it for people to make discoveries. So I think of a cancer data ecosystem as including not just those things that NCI put together and paid millions of dollars for, but all the other pieces that are out there and maintained by the community. The US government thinks the same way. They're beginning to, with Barack Obama giving DJ Patil the title first chief data science officer. Things like data.gov started popping up. If you guys haven't looked, there's something like 900 agricultural data sets. I don't know what any of them are, but they're all here, and they're downloadable and findable and searchable, etc. But they're not part of the data ecosystem yet because we don't think of them as part of our data ecosystem. How do we build a data ecosystem without setting up servers and hooking up cables and plugging in wires? Well, the way we do it these days, the way we used to do it, is that we would build the stuff on the left, we would build all of that in-house. We would have a team, we'd build a building, and we'd set up some stuff. These days, we try to move away from that. I think we should try to move away from that. The same infrastructure, could be in-house or could be cloud, is set up to manage the services on the right-hand side. But now these little green Mu's are microservices. Those microservices supply a very simple or complex data service, but they do one thing and one thing only. And they're interoperable to the extent that they can, you can speak to them from any computer anywhere because they're web-based. But they're isolated from each other. So if I decide to change mine, I'm not going to hurt yours because yours does one thing and mine does something else. And the person who's gluing them all together to do an analysis, of course, needs to take into account that I'm changing things. But these microservices are a much more flexible approach and have a lower bar for production. So in my model of a data architecture for medical or agricultural research, everything is a service. Data comes as a service. Even supplying data or putting data into a repository is a service. Analytics is a service. Machine learning is a service. And all of these things become, if you think of them as services, they become commodities that you can potentially market, you can build on. And if you think of these things as isolated services, pieces of a larger ecosystem, then your ecosystem can actually grow pretty quickly and flexibly. And probably, at least as importantly, it can shrink as well. When you realize that a service is not being used, you can make it go away. A simple service, this is, I put this up as a data sharing note, the beacon network. So in human data, with human data, we don't want to share information. We are not allowed to share information about an individual's genotypes because that's identifiable. So the idea is if I could figure out if a data set had a variant in it without having to access an individual patient, then that tells me something important. It tells me that there's a valuable biospecimen there or valuable data there to be had. So these beacon networks, this beacon network is a network of beacons. The beacons are just the summary information across a set of patients summarized to a single locus, or summarized at each locus. So if a variant is present in some proportion of the population, it gets a 1. If it's not present in the population, it gets a 0. You can't identify then patients. Actually, you probably can, but it takes a large number of queries to identify patients, but it allows us to share data. It's basically a straw man to poke at. How could we share data without actually sharing data? I do think of it as a straw man, and it's a straw man that potentially your communities could use as well. New science and applications. I'm going to just mention data science as a term. I'm not going to focus on it because it's a loaded term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I will say that data science is a thing. It has a special set of skills. It has a special set of people. It has a special set of tools. It has a special set of researchers and research that are distinct from the individual task at hand. Why is that important? Well, the scientific method, right? This is it, right? You've got hypothesis, experiment. You get some knowledge out of it. At some point, you get a conclusion. Unfortunately, that's not the scientific method. The scientific method is something like this mess over here. And And data science, because of so much of our science is data-driven, how we make sense of and how we decide at what point to go the next direction in the experiment is going to be data-driven. In many cases, it's going to be data-driven. So we need people who think about asking questions of data and learning from data that's potentially not, so bioinformatics, for example, I think of as not exactly data science. It's data and science, but it's not data science necessarily. So we need people who think about data critically and generically and use tools that do that. We also need to think about team science and how do we incentivize people, particularly data scientists who are traditionally paid a lot more than we as researchers are, to become part of our team. I'm putting this up, it's really hard to see this. This is a picture of Google Docs. How many people have used Google Docs? And how many find it really spooky that you can see your friend typing at the same time? Yeah. But that's what we want, right? What if we could do that with genomics or with our genomic data? We actually can. We can build collaborative, interactive, and capable now, meaning we can operate on huge data sets. We can do that interactively with a lot of these data science technologies. And this is just a schematic of one of the cancer genomics cloud pilots, pointing out that down at the bottom here is some technologies that are glued together to make cancer data, a small node in the cancer data ecosystem. But how the same infrastructure is able to serve a PI or a biologist with web access to sort of query things graphically, a computational researcher who likes to write in Python or SQL, and then finally an algorithm developer, someone who's actually developing new tools and approaches. All of those people have access to the data, have the ability to instantiate what they're doing in this environment, and probably most importantly, share it with each other at lots of different levels. This is a note to myself that data sharing is hard and expensive. These are tools that our group put together for mining large-scale genomic data. This is all these tools, though, are designed to help us find data and then access it and use it on a laptop. And we have a lot of capabilities for doing some really large-scale genomics work, even on a laptop at this point, through the Bioconductor project. The last detail about how a cancer data or how an agricultural data ecosystem needs to incorporate new changes is that an agricultural data ecosystem needs to incorporate new changes. The Internet of Everything, it's kind of a funny little terminology, but the idea is that when we think about interacting with everything from consumers to stakeholders, to funders, to animals and plants, to other organizations, NIH, CDC, NSF, NOAA, all of those organizations have data coming into them and flowing out of them. And how do you figure out, how do you flow all of that information into your own ecosystem so that it becomes usable to you? That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make copies of it or have it accessible, but what microservices do you need to work with? What microservices do you need to provide that allow your data to be interoperable? This is a note about machine learning and artificial intelligence. I will just note that in order to do machine learning, to learn on a machine, we need a slightly different paradigm. We need the truth first. So typically we take take data and a program, do some computation, we get results. With machine learning, it's backwards, or flip it on its head. We take data and results, and we produce a program that can take new data and give us new results. Why is this paradigm interesting? Because anytime that we have data and results, we can potentially produce new results from new data. And that's something that's I would expect is extremely valuable to your community. And how do you make this happen? Well, you can do it on a one-on-one basis, but an agriculture data ecosystem should support doing this at scale and as generally as possible. I've heard some talk about biomedical data science workforce or agricultural data science workforce. NIH has had some funding in place, and it sounds like from the last couple of days that USDA is beginning to think along the same lines. It's important, it's usually thankless and usually unfunded, but until you make it a priority, until we as a community make it a priority, it's a hook or crook kind of model. Works for most, but not for everyone. There are also online communities, and these can be incredibly powerful. And I gotta be, so this is an online community for bioinformatics. But I hadn't realized how far we had gotten with community engagement until just 2 days ago, so I answer a lot of these things, and I was answering a post from someone who said that he was trying to interpret some genomic findings for a family member, and that he was a medical professional. And I was like, oh my goodness, I gotta call this one out. So, because I don't feel like that's something that we should necessarily be doing in an online forum. That said, it turns out he was very open about things. The family member was himself. So he was a medical professional who had cancer, who was trying to interpret his own genomic findings. Now, that's a sort of a really bleak story, but the cool thing is that he was getting tons of help on this online forum, and he knew to go there to get that help. So my guess is that, again, this community outreach and education process, those are all kind of tied together. So just the fact that this thing existed and helped the bioinformatics community meant that there was a resource for a patient who was in need. And I could imagine the same kind of thing happening for some of the people whose letters you guys read today. If they had a way to really dig into what the problems were in an interactive forum, it might be useful. Agricultural data ecosystem, you may be disappointed, but if you build it, they may not come unless it solves an important problem really, really easily. I will say that despite the fact that, so NCI put together these very large cloud pilots for interacting with genomic data. I taught about 150 investigators how to use these things, and I can tell you of those 150 investigators, probably 2% ended up using them in the long term. So it's not enough to build it and they will come. So what's a different model? It's not about the infrastructure. It's not about microservices. It's about people, right? And this is not a vague kind of thing. You have to pay for these. You have to pay for the people. And so every time that you think about a bioinformatics analysis or building a data center or a new database, you should think about what the people are that are going to make it happen. So there's this guy that I really, really look up to. His name is Matthew Trunell. He was at the Broad. I imagine a few of you might have heard of the Broad Institute. He was at the Broad. He was the chief data officer at the Broad Institute, and really changed the way the Broad works. So he's now at Fred Hutch, and he's building something called the Hutch Data Commonwealth. And the Hutch Data Commonwealth is an analytics platform, and I'll read what he says. The Hutch Data Commonwealth will be a hub for data science, expanding the Hutch's research scope with data resources and tools that will generate new ideas and opportunities. Anybody not want that? So he breaks it down though. Partners, you guys do partners actually pretty well. NIH does not. Process, what does that mean? It means not everybody gets everything, and we can't pay for it all. And platform. So this platform is what I've been kind of focusing on, how we can integrate data coming from different sources, make it usable, shareable, measure its utility, and then continue to iterate on that and grow our data maturity. He breaks it down further into Stakeholders, steering, and partners as the leadership, the guidance, and the driving force. So all the things down at the bottom here, nothing happens. They don't do anything themselves without the stakeholders, steering, and partners driving them. Data acquisition, I heard a lot about that today, phenotyping, et cetera. Data engineering. Data engineering is the data are flowing in, sometimes terabytes at a time. How do I make that accessible and usable by people who understand data? Data analytics. So these are the things that we traditionally think about when we think about bioinformatics, genomics, genotype, phenotype, regression, logistical regression, et cetera. Machine learning, though, and it falls in there. Automation and sensing, I think, slipped across. Sorry about that. And then the last one is really cool to think about. Data product development, which is software engineering, data products, and product management. So he doesn't think about the development of his data product, the end cycle of data analytics as a nature paper. The end cycle of the data analytics is to produce a data product, whether it's a downloadable database or a machine learning model that takes in genotype information and gives out a predicted phenotype. And all of this is developed in a way that's responsive to partners, steering, and stakeholders. So it might be a mobile phone app. It might be a wearable. It might be a thing that measures leaf breathing that we saw this morning. But all of those things get incorporated into data products. And the piece down at the bottom, product management, is really important because these things all cost money to both build and maintain. And if we don't have that product management in piece, it's really easy to have these things get really expensive and go really off track. So he runs that part of things as a little business, basically. So a way of thinking about the problems. Short-term goals, I'm gonna scroll through these. You can read them. The slides are available. Midterm goals. Longer-term goals, I'm gonna spend a touch of time on. Integrative and predictive models for food production. And I put on here G by P by E, and then I put on by economics, but that could be by socioeconomics, that could be by lots of different things. The whole point of this integrated and predictive models is that integrative and predictive does not have to stop with genotype to phenotype. In fact, it shouldn't, right? We need to incorporate things like consumer awareness, consumer interest. Even if you produce a good cow and the consumers don't buy it, that's fine, but it's not going to it doesn't help anybody. Direct to stakeholder analytics and information acquisition. So this is the apps and the Internet of Things. So we'd like all the information coming into our systems to be as automated as possible. Anybody who's tried to maintain an archive of information knows that getting the data in is very, very hard. So automating as much of it as possible is a good thing. And centralizing it to a certain extent is also good. Real-time data acquisition, data collection and integration of agricultural research, commercial, economic, and nutritional health information. So in that line, I've tried to pull in information and data that's coming from other organizations as well. So I know, for example, USDA has an ERS, an Economic Research Service. They're part of the agricultural research data ecosystem by definition because economics impact what you do. Policy and statutes that align with data-driven agricultural research system. It's not enough to write a policy that says you will share all your data. That doesn't help anybody. You need policies that align with those goals of having reusable, findable, attributable, and data that carry utility and value. A workforce that seamlessly transitions into a data economy and ecosystem. And that means in both directions. So you need people who are coming in from the outside who bring skill sets and a way of thinking about data that's different than what we do. It's not the kind of thing that we can get trained on. They think about things differently. They've lived a life that's data rich and data intensive. Bringing those people in, but also vice versa. How do we take our problems and take those to communities that don't think about our problems, the Googles and the Facebooks. How do we go to those folks and talk about our problems in a way that's understandable to them so that they get excited about them and use their Google one day off thing to solve one of our problems? It's actually a real challenge to communicate effectively with data scientists. Information interconnections. So there's a slide that I left out, but the various levels of economies. And some people say that we're in an information economy right now. And the next level that people are proposing is a connected economy. And so it's not enough to say that we have information flowing. We actually have interconnections, both between information and people, that drive what we do and how we behave. And understanding that is going to be part of an ARS and USDA mission going forward. And it's data rich. Challenges, partnering is hard but necessary. Finding connections in data is hard but possible. Sharing and opening data is difficult but important. Data sharing, though, is not the same as reusing and valuing data. Data sharing is not enough. You've got to be able to reuse it. Training and education, it's often thankless and unfunded, but obviously super important. And data reuse is a core value, but it requires policy, infrastructure, incentives, and metrics, really, to make sure that we're being cost effective with the government money. I have some references there, but I'll stop there. No.
Hi, Sean. Thank you very much for your presentation. So you mentioned the randomized experiments for us to learn about causal effects and learn about biology. So in agriculture, we've been doing mostly experiments or randomized experiments to test hypotheses. One thing that we don't do much is to look back at data that we have collected, like farms are collecting data, we have weather data, and farms use different protocols in terms of diet and vaccination and how they manage animals. So I think there is a lot of room for development in this area in agriculture. And the same way we, like randomization, analysis of variance, start in agriculture and now people try to use in medicine. I think we should use more like tools like propensity score or instrumental variable or graphical models to try to mine data that we have already collected, to try to learn causal inferences and then develop intervention protocols and within the precision agriculture, precision management that we are discussing here.
My guess, so I think those are all great comments, and my guess is that when you begin to think about data mining, that the reason that many of us, more of us don't do data mining is we can't find the data and we can't access it. If the data were sitting there and available to us, and we had a few tools that would allow us to interact with the data, it would lower the bar quite a bit to being able to ask questions, most of which will lead to meaningless or negative answers, right? But we can't ask because we don't have a way to find the data, access it, and then use it. It's a process to get that level of data maturity. NIH isn't there. I don't know of anybody who is. But, yeah.
So I think that you touched on a lot of different topics, and one of which I'd like to ask you a quick question on is giving power to end users to analyze all this data. As one of my mentors said last night, it's kind of like giving people bazookas to try to shoot at the data. What do you think about the problem where you give a user way more power, but they also produce a lot of false positive results?
So data science doesn't end with the data. It's still science. The fact that you find a significant p-value doesn't in and of itself mean much. We know that in genomics. We've seen that from the earliest days of linkage analysis through GWAS, through basically every level of genomics, that there are a lot of biases that creep into genomics and also lots of other different types of data science. So validation could be data validation, could be experimental validation, could be integration with other data, other information that makes sense. I agree with you. It's not a so I drew it up there as a biologist sitting at a computer, making discoveries just because you put a cloud computing in front of them. That's not happening. But what is happening is that this used to happen to me all the time, still does. A biologist would come to me and say, I'm working on gene X, and I have been for the last 17 years, but I've never looked in the TCGA data, which is 11,000 patients, to see what that gene does. Whether it's expressed or not expressed, never done it, don't know how to do it. That's what I mean by lowering the bar for data science. It's not that people are going to write Nature papers. The biologist who's never done data science is going to write a Nature paper just because you gave them access to the data. But they can ask questions, and particularly if they can ask questions quickly, getting back to this point, they can generate hypotheses that then may lead to either better data science questions or potentially experimental questions as well that could be answered. So I don't think of it as giving people bazookas. Even if you give people bazookas, they often have a hard time finding the trigger. But if they do, that's an issue. That's what peer review's for. But I think in most cases, giving people access and giving them some facility with information and data that they're comfortable with is really quite powerful for them. And they ask those questions quickly and generate hypotheses. I'm stepping around your question, but yeah.
Well, it's a difficult one.
Yeah,
So
it is.
Who has the authority to regulate that? I think peer review does do some simple good work, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question here.
So all this comes around, I guess, to the question: how do you lower the bar? How do you get feedback from users that tell you, I don't know what the hell this means when I push this button, or I don't know what happens when I push this button?
So I think so I didn't give it justice, and I chose to rush through it at the end. This idea. So I heard in the discussions this morning, one example of a discussion this morning. Wouldn't it be cool if, when we were talking about selective breeding, if there were a way for breeders, producers to submit data to some central repository if they wanted to, and then we could potentially use it and mine it, and ideally give them back better predictions because they gave us their data. And the question then became, well, who does that? Do we leave that to the breeding organizations, or do we pay a company to do that for us, or does USDA do that? Well, in this model, where you're developing a data commonwealth, it's not a question now of developing a database or a button. It's a question of developing a set of skills and an infrastructure to support asking questions by users. And by asking questions, I mean you develop applications that answer their questions. And you obviously want to make those as general as possible, but if they're totally foreign to a user community, a stakeholder community, or a partner community, then you've missed the boat. And it's an iterative process. But the whole idea here is that you put the pieces in place to be able to do this stuff, and you also put the process and the partnerships in place so that at the end it's usable. And that's something that the government sometimes has a hard time doing. We build it and they come, but they don't end up using it because we missed something. No. It's about people, again. It's not about a button or a computer. It's about people. Yeah.
Well, I'm really curious what you think about artificial boundaries. We have a lot of those good examples. Here, USDA running the agricultural generation of the health, and at genomic level, that's the facility division. How do we break those boundaries down?
That's a really good question. I don't have a good answer, but I think one of the challenges that I think of, one of the challenges that I try to address is to be a data advocate. So it's sometimes hard for people who are at a decision-making level to understand what you just said. Was that genomics is genomics. It's not exactly true, but it's hard to get that across without getting down into some of the details of what genomics data are, what some of the infrastructure and technologies need to be, what the costs are, what the decisions that need to be made are, and to drive those forward. To give just a simple example, we have end-of-year funds, and one of the things that we were facing was we as an organization, my part of CCR has about 3 petabytes of data on a high-performance file system at about $700 to $800 per terabyte. So that's all fine because somebody paid for it. It's free to us. But if you have a data advocate, you can look and say, $700 to $800 per terabyte is really expensive compared to the alternative. If I spend $1 million now to buy an alternative and I move some of that data off, I save us a bunch of money. So you need people in your organization. You need a data commonwealth to help to drive these decision processes and to think of it strategically. So again, I'm not answering your question, but the strategy leads to the solution. And you have to start with the strategy, and the strategy starts with having people who understand the problems.
Sean, thank you very much. Let's thank Sean for his talk.